I now want to talk about a short list of common rhetorical choices. So, a couple of you asked me about just ideas of what kinds of things you can analyze. So, when you receive a passage and you're looking at the passage and it asks you to analyze the rhetorical choices or the elements of language or the resources of language or the elements of rhetoric or whatever phrase they use to indicate the issue of what the author is doing to make their writing effective. There's a short list that we can go through here of different kinds of things that you could analyze to answer that question. And that's what I want to look at. I would suggest that you print out this handout, that you have it beside you as you look at the topic, and that you be prepared to use it, to be familiar with it. So perhaps the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about what makes a piece of writing effective, it is the words, and that's what we call diction. And so when you are looking at the passage, you can analyze the diction, but that gets tricky. There's sort of some ground rules you have to follow. First, when you talk about diction, make sure that you are careful to distinguish the diction as word choice from larger ideas. So for example, images that are used, right? Diction is not images. And so be careful with that. Be careful with distinguishing exactly what diction is. Diction is the words. And then the other thing you want to be very, very careful is to never say the phrase, the author uses diction. Of course they use diction. They're writing. Nobody has ever written a thing in the history of the world without using diction. Even hieroglyphics uses diction. So don't say that. It does not sound intelligent. Do not say the author uses diction. Be specific. Add an adjective. The author uses striking diction is okay. Formal diction is better if you can prove it. Concrete diction is even more better. Oops, that was horrible diction. Anyways, but concrete diction is good if they are using concrete nouns, if you can prove that, if you have hard evidence for it, so to speak. Abstract diction can be a little vague. Antagonistic diction, moralistic diction, it's a good one. And so these are just some other things. Accusatory diction and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about a few other pointers here. When you talk about diction, make sure that you quote specific words. Don't quote a sentence to prove the author uses diction. That's pointless. Okay, or uses antagonistic diction. Don't quote the whole sentence. Highlight the words. Talk about the specific words. Talk about what makes the specific words sound aggressive. Why are they aggressive? Is it using language that's martial or military? You know, what makes this diction sound the way that you claim it sounds? Then look for patterns. So if you say that an author uses a particular kind of diction and they have an excerpt that's roughly a page long, one or two words does not prove they use that kind of diction. You should have 6 words from different parts of the essay. Now, what would make this kind of analysis particularly effective if you can show that the author uses different kinds of diction in different parts of the essay. If that is true, then you need to point that out, and that would be a very insightful comment. This is one of the areas that you want to think about the author's tone, and you particularly want to look for changes in tone. If you can find any transition point in the essay, that becomes very helpful in writing your analysis. So as I've said multiple times to several of you, the key to outlining your essay is going to be noticing trends in the author's own writing. So look for points where there's a shift in tone, there's a shift in substance, there's a shift in style, and note those shifts. That can be very, very helpful in your own analysis, paying attention to those shifts, particularly if you can show that shift taking place in the area of diction. That can be helpful. Tone is another element that you can analyze. So the author's use of words often reveals a tone. As with analyzing diction, avoid merely saying the author uses tone, right? For the same reason. Everyone has a tone. I have a tone. I have a tone in this presentation. Sometimes my tone changes. Sometimes my tone's a bit sarcastic. Sometimes it's concerned. Sometimes it's emphatic. Sometimes it's sympathetic. Sometimes it is just that I care about the grade you get. Sometimes my tone in a few emails I sent out recently could sound a bit frustrated. And that's because people aren't reading my instructions as hard as I try to make them clear. Anyway, sorry about that. It snuck in. Anyways, please pay attention to this. Consider the author's shifts or change in tone. I like this word, by the way. Venomous tone. That's great. If you can use that, bonus points. Just kidding. But no, that's good. Ethos, okay? This, of course, is usually, and I think correctly, appeal to credibility. Now, some people think that ethos is an ethical appeal. Now, the reason for that is actually pretty simple. For ancient writers, an author's credibility hinged on their ethic, right? To be a credible person, you had to be a person of character. Now, unfortunately, we've lost that. We think people are credible now regardless of their own personal ethics. Now, that's unfortunate. I think it's horrible. But nonetheless, the overlap between credibility and ethical arguments is real. Make sure you're clear in what you say. I really do think it's better that you avoid using the words ethos, pathos, and logos in your writing. I think they begin to sound overdone because everybody tries to use them and they don't really stand out to your grader as being original or being thoughtful. So instead, talk about the ethical appeal. Talk about the authors establishing their own credibility. You know, whichever of those two you want to do, either one of those is better than saying the author uses ethos. Oh, do they? Really? No. Be specific, okay? So what establishes the author's credibility? Do they give stories from their own experience? Do they talk about what they do? Perhaps even it is their diction that establishes their credibility. If they are very careful in their use of words, that can establish their credibility. If they are using words that are highly specific, that can establish their credibility. If they are people who are clearly trained academically, but they're using words that are common, that says something about their credibility as well. It also says something about their ethics, you know, their own moral standards. They're concerned about their audience. They want their audience to understand. That could be the case. It could also be that they're using common language to cloak the reality. And so there's a sense in which they are not to be trusted. You want to pay attention to all of these issues. The issue of how trustworthy is the speaker is a huge issue, especially if you can prove from their word choice, right, that this isn't that's a matter to be concerned about in this given passage. So the question is, back to the biggest question that you have to ask yourself, what is the author doing? How are they establishing their argument? Are they establishing their own credibility, which then creates this loop. If they are credible, if they establish their credibility, then you'll trust what their writing says, and in their writing, if they're clear, they will further bolster their credibility, and that credibility loop can be an interesting thing to explore. Also, appeals to ethics, right? Ethical appeals are helpful, and here you've got to be careful, because who establishes the ethical norm, right? So when they appeal to ethics, what's their basis for that appeal? Is it sort of a common morality that they assume that all people hold? That can be effective. It can raise some interesting questions. Don't get distracted by those questions, but pay attention. Does the author just assume that everybody is going to see this as right? Is there an appeal to natural law? Or is there an appeal to positive law? So are they appealing to an ethical standard that everybody just agrees with? Or are they appealing to an ethical standard that has been established by a legal system that is recognized in the given context? Again, important questions. You're peeling back the layers. You're looking deeper than the surface. Then let's talk about appeals to emotion. Again, pathos is not particularly helpful here. Some people talk about pathos because they're talking about the emotion of the speaker, the passion of the speaker. Well, that's not really what pathos is, right? Because a speaker gets worked up about something. I could get really excited about rhetorical devices. That does not necessarily appeal to your emotions. It may just make you think that I'm weird. You might be right. But that's beside the point. The issue here is that pathos is the appeal to emotion, right? Now, a speaker might appeal to emotion by showing their own personal emotion. That's not usually a very effective way to appeal to emotion, though. And that might be worth showing. If the speaker allows their own emotion to control them as they're speaking, that actually undercuts both their credibility and it undercuts their appeal to other people. So you've got to think about that issue as well. Don't ever confuse the emotion of a speaker with the appeal to emotion in the audience. Sometimes a person's energy is infectious, right? Sometimes a person being excited about a topic can spread to other people, especially if that excitement comes across as genuine. But if the excitement comes across as just being that the person is extremely excitable, right, then that can actually be a turnoff. It can rub people the wrong way. They can develop a very real resentment to what's being said because of the passion of the speaker. It's far more important to ask yourself, what is this doing for the audience, right? How is this speaker appealing to the emotion of the audience? Is that a prominent point of this, and is it worth analyzing? So when a speaker appeals to the emotion of the audience, they're usually trying to they're trying to use images, right? They're trying to use relatable circumstances. They're trying to use language that evokes an emotional response. They're appealing to the basic instincts of the human heart, such as a love for family, a love for country, a love for security and safety. Those are the kinds of things that evoke an emotional response. So the pathos can be used, but I would strongly recommend that you use the wording appeal to emotion or demonstrates strong emotion, right? And then talk about whether or not that was effective in the passage. And then logos, the appeal to logic. Again, use the wording appeal to logic. And be careful here, because how do you actually prove that an author is appealing to logic? Is a demonstration that the author uses logic necessarily an appeal to logic? So is the use of logic actually an appeal to logic? I'd argue not always. Not always. An author can use logic, but not necessarily be appealing to logic. And so you've got to be careful with your wording here. But some things to pay attention to look for: logical reasons and explanations, convincing facts and statistics, effective supporting evidence, an address of a counter-argument. And with most of these, I would say that this is the author using logical arguments. They're not necessarily appealing to logic. They are not saying, look at logic. Logic is what will save us from this complex circumstance. Just think through this rationally. Those would be appeals to logic. But simply using logic is logic is then sort of the pathway through which, or the conduit through which, they bring other appeals to the table. So you want to be careful with that. Okay? Don't confuse the conduit for what is actually being transported. Don't confuse the pipes for the substance that's coming through the pipe. Okay? Pay attention to that. Okay? Don't get confused. So this goes on to say you can be more specific with the types of appeals, ethos, logos, and so forth, and an author makes. For example, an appeal to morality, an appeal to nationalism, an aesthetic appeal, an appeal to the reader's sensibilities. Those are all actually more effective than simply saying an appeal to logic or an appeal to emotion. So be careful with those appeals. I know they're easy and they're really sort of bottom shelf issues, things that you can get to quickly, but you want to be careful with using them. I had to shift my camera angle to get to the bottom of the page here so we can look at these more carefully. But syntax. This, of course, is the structure of the sentence or the structure of clauses or phrases. Specific structures, parallelism, punctuation, semicolons, em-dashes, those kinds of things are all important aspects of what you can analyze. Now you've got to ask yourself, how does this syntax, how does this specific kind of syntax, how does this broken syntax, this flowing syntax, this truncated syntax, this abrupt syntax, this flowery syntax, how do those things appeal? How do they form an appeal, right? So you've got to be careful with that thought process, but that is an element that you can analyze. Then juxtaposition. This is the placement of specific things beside each other. So you're contrasting two elements or comparing two elements. The placing close together, side by side, contrast or comparison. And here you can juxtapose images, you can juxtapose sentences, paragraphs, ideas, concepts, philosophies, words, people. Any one of those things can be juxtaposed. So you want to use those carefully and to think through that, and it can be a very helpful tool. Imagery. So remember, we've got many different kinds of imagery. Images of touch, taste, smell, sound, sight. You've got abstract images also. You've got kinesthetic imagery, which is the imagery of general movement. These are all things that you can talk about. Concrete imagery. Use these, analyze them carefully, think about the response that they create in the reader. Think about how you can discuss those. Then rhetorical modes. So these are different techniques that are used in writing, and any one of these can be analyzed. So you can talk about the author's use of comparison contrast. You can talk about their use of technical definitions, their use of exemplifications, where they give examples of specific situations. You can talk about their use of narrative. You can talk about their logical portrayal of cause and effect, their systematic classification or division. They're using the structure of problem and solution. They may talk about history or chronological elements. They can do a cost-benefit analysis in their rhetoric to try and prove a point, or a question and answer to prove a point. So this is a short list of elements that can be analyzed, but I think you would be hard-pressed to find an essay in which you could not pick from this list very easily 3 different things that you're going to analyze. So I hope that's helpful. And please think through this, read some example essays, think about how they use these different elements, and best wishes on your exam. I'm going to move on to our next topic.